I want to say a few words about the essay Transparency, Literal and Phenomenal by Colin Rowe and Robert Slutsky. Now, it's an essay that proposes that some spaces that are designed in the modern idiom, let's say, can be, just some, not all, can be either seen as being literally transparent and some can be seen as phenomenally transparent. Now, the literal transparency part, that's actually quite easy to explain, I think. The phenomenal transparency element, that's a little bit trickier to explain. I think this is perhaps the reason why people give up on reading the essay and think maybe it's just too obscure or that Rowe himself is being too difficult. But I happen to think that the ideas in the essay are quite fruitful. They're sort of rich. They're worth the thinking about. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try to explain them. Now, I'm going to start off by talking about literal transparency, which I think is really quite connected to the tradition of drawing and painting in perspective. Now, perspective drawing and painting was developed in the early 15th century, and it was a way of showing space, the world, in what we might call a realistic way. Now, I mean realistic in inverted commas. The way that it appears, let's say, to our eyes, space as we perceive it. Now, up until this point, that is the early 15th century, painters, they hadn't got a foolproof technique, a mechanical technique that could be repeatable for showing how space appears to us. So if, for example, you look at some medieval paintings, some pre-Renaissance paintings, you'll notice that the figures of the saints or Christ or whoever, that they are represented very well. The features are very, very nicely done. But frequently these figures will appear to be floating in space without any direct connection to one another. Spatially, they might appear naive or almost like a child's drawing. Well, once perspective technique had been developed, it gave us a very convincing sense that space could be a coherent, connected unity. And we could show it in this way in a painting or in a drawing. So in this painting here by Perugino of 1480, 1481, you'll see what I mean. So here you can see a very strong one-point perspective view is presented to us. And in it we can see that every element in the scene is located in a very precise way. And each element is located relative to every other element in a very precise way. There's no doubt about it. It's very, very clear. It's as clear as a bell. There's no ambiguity. And in a way we might say that it looks, or it has the feeling of the kind of Cartesian geometry that we might have come across in secondary school. That the space is systematic. That every character within this picture can be located in terms of X, Y, and Z. And it's very, let's say, continuous, if you know what I mean. Now, one of the other things that we can say about this type of perspective representation, especially when we're talking about one-point perspective, not 2 points so much, but one-point perspective, is that it makes things very obvious to us, even perhaps when we can't actually really see them. So if we take this example here, this is one of the ideal city paintings of 1480. I think there are three. They're kind of similar, but by different artists. And they have an interesting story to tell themselves. But anyway, if I look at this particular painting here, although I can only see part of the facade of this circular temple or church type building, which is in the center of things, sort of in the center of the square there, I already know somehow what the back of this building looks like, even though I can't actually see it. And then similarly, although I can't literally see up the side streets of this town, I do have a really good idea of what these streets already look like. I know how tall the buildings are. I kind of know how far apart from each other they are and so on. If one of them turned out to be exceptionally tall, it would be a real shock because the information that's been given to me in this painting is kind of clear. Somehow I can tell. You might say that the space in the town, in this particular town, is literally transparent. So literal transparency. In this 20th century building here that you'll all know by Mies van der Rohe, this is the Farnsworth House. Well, this building is obviously, well, it's very modern. You might almost say that it's the definition of modern architecture. It has rolled steel columns and it has plate glass windows and all of this kind of stuff that architects back in, let's say, Perugino's day they never would have had, so we know we're talking about the 20th century at the earliest. Now, however, at some level though, if we're talking about how space is represented in this building, there is a very strong similarity between the kind of space that Mies is at here and the type of thing that we found in the perspective paintings of the 15th century. In the Farnsworth House, space is literally transparent. First of all, there's an obvious one to talk about. The large plate glass windows, well, they're intended to let me see everything that's going on inside. But you'll notice that in this photograph, and in almost every other photograph you'll find of this building, there's a strong sense of perspective, of it being represented in perspective. And part of this is reinforced by the pattern of the floor tiles, which create this very strong sense of perspective. And furthermore, although in this particular case here, with this particular photograph, I'm limited by the point of view of where the camera is located, at some level, if someone were to ask me, can I imagine what this building is like from the opposite side? Well, I'd say, yeah, I have a pretty good idea of what the building's like from the opposite side. It's kind of pretty much like what I already see. So that when I look at the plan, for example, there's nothing very surprising about it. Now, I'm not saying that there's nothing, that it's not beautiful. I mean, I happen to think it's a very beautiful plan. But the beauty of it, in a way, is that the space is clear and unified. So each individual area of the building, the kitchen area, the sitting area, the bedroom area, each individual area is completely connected to each other area. And the floor plan can't really be understood by considering the parts separately. You can only really understand the plan when you take all of the elements together. And I can do this very, very easily because the architecture of the Farnsworth House is literally transparent. It's made very obvious to me. So hopefully that gets the point across about literal transparency. Now, phenomenal transparency is a much trickier thing to come to terms with. So here's the hard bit, and here goes. Now, I think the best place to start is with this particular diagram here, which I'm sure you've seen 1,000 times before. We call this a figure ground diagram. We look at it one way and we see a black vase against a white background, and then we look at it the other way and we see two white faces. And then if I look at it for a couple of seconds, I can almost kind of move between the two ways of interpreting the image, and I can almost see the two things instantaneously, if you like. Now, the other thing that I can say about this image is that although it's completely two-dimensional, and although the artist makes no attempt to represent space in 3 dimensions, that is to say, there's no attempt here to show anything in perspective, there is nevertheless a 3-dimensional sensation. So if the vase is closer to me than the background, then clearly at some level, I'm in 3-dimensional space. And when I change modes and I see the faces, something slips into the background and something moves forward simultaneously. So something about what's happening in my imagination, you might almost call it transparent. Two different things are going on at the same time in the same place, but without one of the things getting destroyed by the other thing. They're happening simultaneously, so some kind of transparency is there. Now, Rowe and Slutsky, this is an oversimplification of what they're saying, but they suggest that this kind of thing was going on in modern painting of the 19 teens and 20s, and in modern architecture. If we start off with their point about modern painting, they say that the Cubists had no interest whatsoever in representing space in perspective mode. They say the Cubists wanted to work on a flat canvas and give the viewer a sense of space which is much more similar to the figure ground diagram that we were looking at a minute ago. So that's where they're coming from. And what they do in the essay is they compare two paintings to make their point. Now, the one on the left is by Picasso and the one on the right by Braque, and they were both painted around the same time, I think about 1911. Now, what Rowe and Slutsky say here is, it's pretty interesting actually, really. They say that if you look at the Picasso, even though it looks very much like a typical Cubist painting, they say it's not actually really all that cubist. If you look closely enough at the painting, they say you can pick out a main character, and this character sitting in the middle of the canvas, and that at some level there's a feeling of space receding into the background behind that character, a bit like a perspective painting. And then they say, look at the Braque piece, and they say, look here, there's no sense of anything being in perspective here at all. There is an idea of space coming across. We get a sense of depth, but it's all happening in the plane of the picture. So he's using a different, and maybe they would be suggesting a more sophisticated technique of depicting space. Now, Rowe and Slutsky say that the same phenomenon is going on in some modern architecture as well, not all. And to illustrate their point, they choose the Villa Stein by Le Corbusier, which was, I don't know whether it was designed or built. 1927 is the date. I don't know whether it's design or it's building. But they choose this example to illustrate the point that they're trying to make. Now, I have to say that I've personally thought long and hard about all of this, and being honest about it, I don't think it's the best example available to illustrate the point they want. And I think this is one of the reasons why people get frustrated with the essay, because what they're trying to say isn't really all that obvious, in my view, from the Villa Stein. Now, they make various points, but of the points that they make, from my perspective, only one of them really resonates, and I'll try to point that out. So, they point at the glazing on the Villa Stein, which in some ways you might say is quite similar to what we see in the Farnsworth House. You know, it's large plate glass glazing. But in the Villa Stein, the authors say that the function of the glass isn't really to be completely transparent, as it is in Farnsworth. In Farnsworth, it's almost to be as invisible as possible, to give us the fullest view of what's going on inside. What Rowe and Slutsky say is that the glass in the Villa Stein is only partially transparent. It does give us a sense of what's going on behind it, but it's doing something else as well. It's sort of inviting us in a way to look at it. Because from an architectural point of view, it's actually enclosing some of the space that's behind the wall. It's not just being transparent, it's acting as some form of enclosure. I think it's a reasonably made point, and it's legible, but I don't think it's particularly compelling, to be honest with you. Now, I happen to think that there's another example of modern architecture which makes the point that they're trying to make a little bit more clearly. Now, it's not the perfect example of the argument they're making. It may be oversimplifying them a little bit, but it's definitely a set of ideas which are much more easier for the rest of us to grasp. Now, as it happens, it refers to a work ironically, by Mies van der Rohe. That's the man who did the Farnsworth. And it's his design for the brick house, or the brick country house, as it's sometimes called, of 1925, which was never actually built. Now, if we look at this plan here for the brick house, first of all, even if we're not experienced in reading architectural plans, we can tell that some of the walls in this building are clearly on the outside. They're exterior walls, and that they're being used to divide up the garden into courts. But while this is definitely clear to us, there's still a question about what is and what isn't a part of the house. Is everything that's on the outside part of the house, or is it only the bits that are on the inside that are part of the house? So the reading of the plan is deliberately made ambiguous, and the feeling of the space, for us anyway, well, maybe for me, I think it's somehow the richer. Okay, now, if I just take the argument a little bit further, I could say that if I look at this plan, that the top left quadrant is supposed to be the garden, and the other three quadrants are supposed to be the house. And there is a reading that, I think that's quite obvious that we could say this. Now, there's another point I could make. It's definitely heavily implied when we look at this plan that the house is divided into 4 sections. Let's just call them quadrants. I know they're not really quadrants, but let's just say. So if you were to ask me to define the bottom left quadrant, I could fairly easily do that by projecting to the point where I imagine these 2 main walls might meet. So I could say, I think that's the quadrant there. It's kind of implied. Now, if you were to ask me to define the top right-hand quadrant, I could do exactly the same exercise, but when I place the diagram for this second quadrant over the diagram for the first, I can see that they overlap. So there is a sense that spaces can be read two ways, that the building can be read two ways. Now, if I were to continue on with this exercise at the level of the individual spaces, I can have even more fun. So if we take this space here, I could say, well, this is the living room and it's divided into two zones by a fireplace. However, if I read it another way, I could say, well, actually the lower part of that space, it actually belongs to a different arrangement entirely. It's part of the dining area. Or I could say, well, actually, my mind is capable of accepting it as both, and I don't feel put out or uncomfortable about that. So the fact that the space can have this dual presence, it doesn't really upset me, because the architect isn't doing it out of a sense of confusion. The architect, it's quite the opposite. The architect is doing this because they have a sense of control. And once it's this duality about these spaces is pointed out to us, we begin to accept it conceptually. And what we're doing in a way is we're accepting something, a type of transparency which is more conceptual or phenomenal and not literal. Okay, so arguing that the brick house is a good example of phenomenal transparency, it sort of comes unstuck when we look at the elevations that Mies van der Rohe proposed for it. I think this is the only drawing we have of what the house would have looked like, and to me, it's a huge disappointment. I think nothing about the appearance of this building suggests the kind of complexity that we were just looking at in the plan a couple of minutes ago. It just seems completely underworked, maybe rushed, not thought through enough. And I don't know, maybe this is the reason why. Maybe it was too hard to do, and maybe it's the reason why it never got built, but it doesn't follow through to the third dimension. But before we move on from the topic, I'll just have a look at another of Mies van der Rohe's buildings from around the same period. This is the Barcelona Pavilion of 1929. And although in some ways it is harder to analyze, in another way, because it's built, it has a third dimension, we can actually perhaps see what phenomenal transparency might look like in the flesh. So it's sometimes cited by writers and theorists as being a very good example of a building that is both literally and phenomenally transparent. I was going to say at the same time, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is that it has both literal and phenomenally transparent components. So the literal transparency is clear enough from this image here. You can see it, that there's we can see through parts of the building very, very clearly. Now, the part that people refer to as phenomenal is more apparent from the plan. So some writers have suggested that the space in the building is organized into a series of layers which are kind of quite clear. They're almost like laminates. However, when the visitor moves from one layer to another layer, the feeling is of somehow being transported, and the two spaces coincide with one another. They sit side by side and have a relationship, if you like, of being phenomenally transparent one to the other. That pretty much wraps up what I wanted to say about literal and phenomenal space in architecture. But before I go, there are a couple of other phenomena that they relate to the world of art and painting and to film, and I think they deal with phenomena which are very, very closely related to what I think is phenomenal transparency. And I think they're worth mentioning because once we start to think about them, I think they help us to understand a little bit better what Colin Rowe is saying. So they're not exactly the same thing, but they are related, and they're a bit of fun, let's say, to think about. Okay, so the first is to do with film. Now, when people started first making films in the late 19th century, the length of the film was limited to the length of the film roll. So in other words, stories were extremely short. Now, one way to get around this problem, the problem of like the duration of the story, was some folks said, well, why don't we film a piece of film in one camera and film the scene from another camera and stick the pieces of film together, and that way we'd be able to double the length of the film. Well, this was a proposal, and some people said, well, it's not going to work because the viewer is going to become very confused, they won't be able to follow the storyline and so on. Now, as it happens, if the filmmaker, provided the filmmaker was to follow a certain set of rules about where the camera is placed and about eye lines and so on, it turned out that the viewer, the audience, didn't have a problem at all in following the film. They were able to follow the story completely without getting confused in any way. And as a matter of fact, it turned out that a lot of the time people didn't even notice that the point of view of the camera had changed. And so the standard style of editing, or the Hollywood style of editing that we're all so used to, that we've seen in so many films and so many TV shows, this is where it was developed. This is where it came from. And typically we might say very often it comprises a shot on an actor or a thing, and then the reverse angle on the other actor or the other thing. And provided the camera moves within a very limited range, we don't even notice that this is happening. And I'd argue that it is it's sort of the equivalent of literal transparency, the type that we find in architecture. Now, as it happens, this wasn't the only technique for editing which emerged at the start of the film era. The Russian filmmaker, Sergei Eisenstein, he was actually very much against this approach, this Hollywood or continuity style approach to film editing. He argued that there was a better way of doing it. Now, his approach is often referred to as montage or montage type editing. When you get into it, it gets a little bit tricky, but what I'm going to do is just stick to the basics. So what Eisenstein argued was that the standard way of setting up a scene in angle on reverse angle, he said this is just completely lacking. He said the better way to go was to set up a shot to be filmed in one possible way to get the perfect shot that you need. Each shot in the film, although it's related in some way to the previous one, at some level, each shot is highly independent and it contains its own very strong visual integrity and identity. And his point was that the narrative power, the intrigue of the film, it was better served when each shot in the film carried its own significant visual impact. So you layered one image on top of another. Each image was actually quite strong, and rather than putting the audience off completely, it actually gave them a much richer visual experience.
Сильно будет, признают. Впрочем, некоторые опытные не очень восторгаются этим венчанием. Недовольство тех вельмож понятно, что кузен великому князю Вольдемар Старицкий с матерью. Венчание Иоанна с царем усложняет их путь до трона московского. Но есть как будто и сторонники Иоанна. То родственники невесты великого князя. Не великого князя, а царя. Уже царя. Боговечанный царь, прими от Бога скипетр сей, прими, сын мой. Бога державу силу. Прими, сын. Ныне и присно, и вовеки веков.
Perspective painting wasn't the only thing that the Renaissance painters were up to in the 15th century. If we take this painting here, the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck, we can see that it's more than just a one-point perspective. So if we look at it casually, it just looks like it's the picture of a man and a woman in a small room, the woman apparently pregnant. But if we look at what's going on in the background, we can see that the mirror on the wall shows the scene that we're looking at from the front angle. It shows it from the reverse angle. It's perfectly painted, except that it can't be accurate, that mirror on the wall, because in the mirror, the Arnolfinis are standing in front of what looks like either one or two people, and some folks have speculated that they're actually the witnesses to the Arnolfinis' wedding. But these witnesses are standing in the space that Van Eyck would have to be in if he was actually doing the painting. He'd have to be sitting there painting this thing for this painting to be realized. So what he's doing is he's playing a game with our sense of time and space. It's like as if there's a parallel reading of what's going on in the room besides the obvious one that we saw the first time. And in fact, this second one, this parallel one, in some ways, once we notice it, it becomes more compelling. I think that something similar is at play in this scene from the film Playtime by Jacques Tati. Now, Playtime is, well, it's a very interesting film in lots of different ways, and it's one of the cult favourites of architects everywhere. And in the scene that I'm showing now, that's running in the background, we're looking from the street, literally, into adjacent apartments with glass that's so clear that it's almost not there. Now, we can see the occupants in both apartments. They're both watching television. Now, each television is located on exactly the same spot on the party wall that divides the two apartments. So it looks, in a way, it looks like as the two families or the two groups are watching television, it looks a little bit like they're looking at each other through a hole in the wall.
Birthday, Bing.
Okay, so lest you get the impression that the concept of phenomenal transparency is only to be found in obscure French and Russian films and only in little-known works of architecture, here's an example from something that most people have probably seen. This is the opening of Hitchcock's classic film Rear Window. And with a bit of luck, after what we've just been talking about, you might be able to see for yourself what I've been getting at.
When you wake up in the morning, do you feel tired and run down? Do you have that listless feeling?
And the